Hi guys. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Is my microphone working? I had a bit of a problem last week. There aren't many people here. Shall I just wait for 1 or 2 minutes? There are supposed to be 80 people in this class, so let me just wait for 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, I guess I can just get started. So today I just want to push ahead with Hegel, and Hegel's quite difficult. So if you read Hegel, my experience of reading Hegel even now is I'll read a chunk of it, and there'll be kind of passages where it sort of makes sense, and then everything goes a bit fuzzy, and it's sort of it's unclear how what he's saying fits together. Yeah, so I think Hegel is one of the more difficult philosophers to read and to interpret. So what I wanted to do today was actually kind of work through quite closely some of the text. So we've actually, and I think with Hegel, like with a philosopher, there's different ways one can go. One can try and kind of see the whole thing, yeah, and go for breadth, get as much as possible. I'm sort of doing that with Nietzsche. We're going to read a whole book of Nietzsche. Or one can just sort of dip in and get a little taste. And you know, you can either have with Nietzsche, we're having a main course. With Hegel, it's a bit more like meze. We're going to dig in. We're going to look at a couple of the snacks on the table, and we're going to get a little taster of Hegel. And I think this is quite appropriate with Hegel, because with Hegel, the whole is sort of contained within the parts. Yeah, so one way of understanding Hegel is to kind of go outwards. But I think Hegel's got this idea that if you go inwards, in the microcosm, you see the macrocosm. Yeah, so by focusing on a little bit, this is one way of seeing the whole. Yeah, that whatever way you go, you're going to kind of, in some sense, come back to where you began. And this is something we're going to talk about when we look at section 2, where he talks about the idea of philosophy as a circle. So what I want to do with Hegel is I want to sort of work through some of the text in detail. I hope you've read this stuff. My guess is that if you've read it, there's lots of it you've missed and haven't really understood. So I think, yeah, this is why I want to work through it. So what I'm going to work through is, first of all, I'm going to finish off talking about the preface. We're going to look at some detail about this claim that the rational is actual and the actual is rational. So we're going to spend a bit of time working through this claim about the rationality of the actual. We're then going to look at what he says about roads and jumping, this sort of pun he has with the rose and the cross. And then we're going to talk about his conception of the task of philosophy. And the task of philosophy, as he takes it, is a sort of project of reconciliation. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of philosophy as reconciliation. What? Do you know this word reconciliation? How do you say this in Turkish? What does it mean? Reconciliation. Anyone? That wasn't a rhetorical question.
Does it mean something like?
Oops, Atesh, I can't hear you.
You can't.
Can you hear each other? Can anyone hear him?
Yeah, we can hear him.
You can. Oh, hold on. So my headphones aren't working. Let me. Oh, hold on. Okay, try again.
Can you hear now?
I think Atesh, you were trying to say something.
Can you hear now?
Yeah, I can hear.
Does it mean something like?
Yeah.
reuniting, or putting
Yeah,
together?
yeah. So reconciliation is something that happens if you've got a friend and you've had an argument and you've sort of broken up as friends. Yeah. Reconciliation is something like re-establishing your friendship. Yeah. So for reconciliation to be possible, you need a period of apartness. You need some sort of alienation. So reconciliation works something like this. You start off with some sort of unity. You've got this friendship and you're just mates. And then you have a time of sort of alienation, apartness. And then reconciliation is like becoming friends again, re-establishing that sort of lost unity. Yeah, so reconciliation is re-establishing a sort of lost unity. And this idea of reconciliation is central to Hegel's philosophy. It's obviously tied to the idea of alienation, because you can only really be reconciled if at some point you've been alienated. Hold on, is there a problem with my internet? Is it breaking up at all? No?
It's okay for
I
me.
remember okay. If there is a problem, let me know as soon as it happens, and I'll switch to my phone's internet. Yeah, so reconciliation is a central idea in his philosophy. This is what he takes to be the task of philosophy. And of course, reconciliation presupposes some form of alienation. And Hegel wants to tie alienation with self-consciousness. Yeah. So in some sense, the animal is at home in the world. Human beings, because we're capable of reflection, because we're capable of self-consciousness, in some sense, this splits us off from nature. And this splits us off from ourselves. There's a sort of division between us and the world, but there's also a division within ourselves between the I that is conscious and the I that we're conscious of. Yeah? Self-consciousness always involves this split in the I. And Hegel's sort of project is to explain how we can be self-conscious, yeah, while at the same time not being alienated. How can we be reflexive beings who aren't cut off from ourselves? And ultimately, and quite kind of bizarrely, he thinks that this is only possible in a sort of modern state. So somehow non-alienated self-consciousness is only possible in the right kind of political civic environment. Yeah, in a community in which you have what he calls ethical life. Yeah, and so the project of reconciliation is central to his philosophy, and we can think of this project of reconciliation from both the theoretical perspective and the practical perspective. Yep. From the theoretical perspective, it's a matter of how can I be self-conscious, but the I that is conscious in some sense be the same as the I that it's conscious of. So there's a theoretical account of alienation where being conscious and being self-conscious involves this sort of split in the I. But there's a sort of practical aspect of this as well. As practical beings, we're not just beings that have instincts and drives, but as reflexive, self-interpreting animals, we're capable of reflecting on our drives, on our desires. Yeah. And once again, this makes a split between ourselves as reflecting and the self that we're reflecting on. Yeah, Ozan?
Last semester, we talked about how when we look for the I inwardly, we wouldn't, find one, and we couldn't spot it. And I don't understand how that kind of split works. Like when we can't observe the I, we can just be the I. If that makes sense.
Okay, so this is something, so I'm giving you an outline of what we're going to look at today or this week. So we're going to look at the preface. I'm just going to run ahead now, and I'm coming to answer your question, but I'm going to tell you when we're going to start answering it. Then we're going to look at the introduction, number 1 and number 27. Yeah. So number 1, he introduces the idea of right. He's going to tie this to the idea of freedom, and the freedom is going to. I am going to come back to your question, but there's going to be a little bit of a minute. Yeah, we have this idea of freedom, and it turns out that the freedom for Hegel is going to turn out to be something like the practical analog of self-consciousness. So Hegel's against this divide between the theoretical and the practical. Theoretical and practical attitudes are just 2 aspects of one thing. So we have a sort of reflexive idea from the theoretical idea, which is the idea of self-consciousness. And self-consciousness, if we think about what self-consciousness is, this is the Aristotelian idea of contemplation, that self-consciousness is basically the idea of thought thinking itself. Yeah, that's what self-consciousness is. And freedom is like the practical version of, for Hegel, it's the practical version of self-consciousness. It's self-consciousness in some sense from the practical aspect. So if self-consciousness from the theoretical aspect is thought thinking itself, from the practical perspective, well, how can we make this, how can we have a practical idea that is like the idea of thought thinking itself? This is the idea of freedom. So the idea of freedom is the idea of willing itself. Yeah, we've got thought thinking itself, and then we've got the idea of willing itself. And willing itself is the idea of self-determination. Yeah, so we've got this idea of freedom as self-determination. So this is going to be the central idea in the introduction, introducing this idea of freedom and how we are to understand freedom and how freedom is possible. And it's going to turn out that Hegel thinks that freedom is only possible for will to will itself in the modern state. Yeah, the modern state.
I think your internet
sense,
connection
Hegel's
is
gonna
weak.
Okay. Okay, let me set up this hotspot. Yeah. Yeah, I got myself a kind of 80 gigabyte package. I hope that will last the whole semester, because, you know, we're not paid enough to. Okay. Am I back? Yeah, it took a little bit of time. Okay. Yeah. So we get this idea of freedom as willing itself. So I'm telling you if this is all we look at for the rest of the time on Hegel, I think we would have done quite well. I want to look at a bit more, but if I just get through this stuff. So number 27, we get this idea that we have this idea of the absolute determination of the free spirit is to make freedom into its object. Yeah, the abstract concept of the idea of the will is in general the free will which wills the free will. Freedom is the free will that wills the free will, or the will that wills the will. Yeah, and this is the idea he's going to try and unpack in the introduction. So on my reading of the introduction, we introduce this idea of the will. The idea of the will is freedom, and then we have a little digression. So, sorry, this is really annoying for you, I know. Yeah, we have a little digression, and then we've got And in the digression, in number 2, he talks a bit about the methodology of philosophy and the methodology of philosophy being circular. So I'm going to talk a bit about, this is a separate little topic that sometimes we could skip, but I think it's interesting. We have the idea of the methodology of philosophy being circular. So that's number 2 in the introduction. And then in number 3, we talk about historicism and the idea that things can be justified in terms of their historical origin. So we might offer an account of the justification of, say, gender roles within the family in terms of giving a story about why families emerged. And Hegel thinks that such historicism offers a form of justification, but it's going to turn out that he offers a sort of critique of historicism. So something can be historically justified, but not justifiable in itself. So I think number 3, last class we talked a bit about his conservatism and how what is actually is rational. I think one of the things about number 3 in his discussion of historicism is that not everything that can be justified historically in its time is justifiable in itself. And so the example I think he gives of this are, the 2 examples he gives are ancient slavery and the patriarchal family and the Roman idea of family life. Yeah, so section 3, we have a discussion of historicism. And then sections 4, 5, 6, and 7, I take it are the central sections in the introduction. And we get basically the whole of Hegel's philosophy in these 4 sections. Yeah, so hopefully today we're going to get to sections 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the introduction. But these are the sections these are, I think, the sort of central section that if you can understand, or if you can think what's going on in these sections, you've done a good job in basically getting the basic ideas of Hegel's system. Now, Ozan, you asked the question about how we can know how self-consciousness is possible. Is that your question?
It was how can we talk about a split eye that we are both the observer and what is being observed when we can't spot the eye in ourselves?
Yeah, so the way I put it there was a way of trying to get you to kind of see the rough idea of Hegel's position. Hegel's position is a bit more complicated than that. So he thinks that when we think about the I, what am I, that we have these different ways of thinking about what I am. And these different ways of thinking about what I am, there's going to be 2 of them in particular that I think are tied to this idea of the split. So on the one hand, we can see ourselves as free, as potential. We can see ourselves in terms of the possibility of choice. I can see myself as this abstract I think, the Kantian I think that can attend all of my thoughts. And I think Hegel thinks that part of this self-conception does involve this sort of abstract I, the I as possibility, the I as arbitrary freedom of choice. And I think that kind of goes with the thinking I, the I as subject. But he also thinks that when we think of ourselves, we also think of ourselves as the sort of embodied historical I. We think of ourselves as in terms of the choices we've made, the things that we've done in the past. Yep. So the way we think of ourselves, there's this tension, and there's various ways of characterizing this tension between the I that thinks and the I that is thought, between the I as indeterminate, the I as determinate. Yeah. But in 4, and especially 5, 6, and 7, we get these 2 pictures of the I, and then we get the idea that the task of philosophy is to provide us with a way of thinking about ourselves that kind of overcomes these sorts of dichotomies. So Ozan, why don't we wait till we start looking at numbers 5 and 6 of the introduction? Did you look?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the overview of what we're going to look at today, and maybe this week. Now we're going to start off finishing the preface. We're then going to look at numbers 1 and 27 of the introduction. And this is where he introduces the idea of freedom. And this is going to be central to the idea of right. Then there's 2 digressions, sections 2 and sections 3. The first digression is about methodology. The second digression is about is about history and about the way in which history, the limits of historical justification, which I think is important because it kind of pushes against a certain way of reading Hegel. And then we get the start of what I take to be his sort of positive account of the will, the positive account of the I taken practically. So when we think of the I, we can think of the I from the sort of theoretical perspective as a sort of knowing I, the I of cognition. And the phenomenology of spirit starts off with the sort of knowing subject. Yeah, and it looks at inadequate ways of thinking about self-knowledge and about self-consciousness. I take it that the bits of the introduction to the philosophy of right we're going to look at are basically doing the same thing, but in terms of the acting I, the I as self-conscious agent. And once again, it's going to turn out there are these inadequate ways of thinking about agency and self-conscious agency and the will. And he's trying to develop an adequate way about thinking about ourselves as agents. And it's going to turn out, he thinks, that we can only adequately really think of ourselves as agents within the context of a modern state. Yeah, and a modern state in which we have the emergence of ethical life. And we'll come to that. So that's basically what I want to look at this week. Okay, so let's jump back to the preface. So I'm going to start by looking at page 20. Is there anyone there who's in a quiet place who would like to read any of these? I know that some of you are probably in public spaces. If anyone's somewhere private and fancies reading, any volunteers? Okay, Ozan, do you want to start with?
Okay, but I mean, is this okay, my voice?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, all right. It is this very relation of philosophy to actuality, which is the subject of misunderstandings. And I accordingly come back to my earlier observation that since philosophy is exploration of the rational, it is for that very reason the comprehension of the present and the actual, not the setting up of a world beyond which exists God knows where, or rather of which we can very well say that we know where it exists, namely in the errors of a one-sided and empty, I don't know the word,
ratiocination. Ratiocination is what he's talking about here is the understanding. Yeah, so the understanding in its logical categories, that we can think about this in terms of coming up with abstract conceptions of what ought to be. I take it the sort of idea here is that some people think that the goal of philosophy is to develop some sort of ideal, yeah, to provide us with an account of the ideal state. Yeah, and then we can use this abstract conception of the ideal to judge the present, to judge the actual. And I take it that this is the sort of one of the main targets in the preface. Philosophy is the exploration of the rational. But because if we think that the present actuality contains rationality within itself, then the task of philosophy is, as Hegel puts it in the preface, is to understand the rationality of what actually exists. And as this is part of his philosophy of spirit, he's interested in understanding the rationality within the social world in which we find ourselves. And I think he thinks that this isn't really that paradoxical, because the social world in which we find ourselves is a bunch of institutions that are the product of human activity. And insofar as human activity, insofar as we're rational animals, the sorts of institutions that we create are going to be imbued with rationality and thought. Yeah. And if these institutions are the product of sort of rational agency, if the social institutions in our world are the product of rational agency, then reflecting on these is a way of in some sense, thought thinking itself. Because in some sense, insofar as we're rational minds, and the social world, it is to at least some degree the product of rational activity, then reflecting on and understanding the rationality of the institutions within which we find ourselves is going to turn out to be a form of self-consciousness. Yeah, it's rational animal knowing its own product, its own rational product. Now, this leads him to the most famous saying probably in the philosophy of right: what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. Now, last time I pointed out that the term actual is a technical term in Hegel, that there are many things that exist that are not really actual. So this is a quote from later on in the philosophy of right, and I read this last time in class, but let me go through it again, because you may not have, because it was in a face-to-face class, you may not have had a chance to read it when I read it out. He says, the state is actual, and its actuality consists in, sorry, I'm sharing this different quote. Let me have one. The state is actual, and its actuality consists in the fact that the interest of the whole realizes itself through the particular ends. Actuality is always the unity of universality and particularity, of something conceptual and something existent. Yeah, the resolution of universality into particularity. The latter, the particularity, what exists, then appears to be self-sufficient, although it is sustained and supported only by the whole. If this unity is not present, if this sort of unity of thought, if the unity of the concept, if the rationality is not present, nothing can be actual, even if it may be assumed to have existed. A bad state, yeah, is one which merely exists. A sick body also exists, but it has no true reality. A hand which has been cut off still looks like a hand and exists, but has no actuality. True actuality is necessity. What is actual is necessary in itself. Yeah. So we have this claim in the introduction that what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. And I take it that conservatives, I mean, one way of reading this is this conservative reading of Hegel, and this is how Hegel wanted to present himself to the censors, that in some sense, the state itself is necessarily rational. But of course, this isn't what Hegel's saying. Hegel's saying that insofar, yeah, he's not denying the possibility of bad states. What he wants to deny, though, is that we can judge that a state is bad by comparing it to some abstract political ideal. Yeah, this is the main problem. Hold on. Yeah. So the task of philosophy, as he sees it, the tasks of political philosophy, is to understand the way in which the institutions of the modern state are rational. And that he introduces what I take was taken up by the Marxists as something like some sort of distinction between base and superstructure. Yeah, to say that the actual is rational isn't to say every aspect of the modern world is rational, but there's some basic underlying rationality in the basic structure of the society. Yeah, we might think of the rationality as sort of lying in the base, and the superstructure isn't necessarily something that is the subject of philosophy. So this is the point he makes at the bottom of the page. So he says, for what matters is to recognize in the semblance of the temporal and transient, the substance which is immanent and the eternal which is present. So the task of philosophy is to recognize the eternal in the present, to recognize the timeless within time, to recognize the divine within the human. Hegel started off as a theologian, so he was studying theology, and his earlier work was on Jesus. And Jesus is interesting because Jesus, in the kind of Christian tradition, is both human and God. Yeah, the appearance in the present. Yeah, this is the appearance of the substance, the eternal, within the temporal and the transient. Yeah, and so I take it as a sort of way in which Hegel's philosophy of the state has this sort of background in Christian theology, in terms of the idea of the embodiment of God, of the embodiment of reason, yeah, the embodiment of logos, yeah, that reason is something that can be embodied within our political institutions. And of course, the reason for this is these political institutions are the results of the reification of human rational agency. So there's this sort of Christian theological idea that's sort of naturalized and secularized, I take it, in Hegel. But in some sense, the task of philosophy is to recognize the eternal in the present, the rational in the action. And that and so he says, for since the rational, which is synonymous with the idea, becomes actual by entering into external existence, it emerges in an infinite wealth of forms, appearances, and shapes, and surrounds its core, yeah, so we've got the core, with a brightly colored covering, yeah, in which consciousness at first resides, but which only the concept can penetrate in order to find the inner pulse and detect its continued beat even within the external shapes. So reason, in some sense, looks at these institutions, looks at social life, but it doesn't look at the brightly covered coloring, but it looks at the core, the underlying structure, the underlying, the base, the underlying structure of the institutions, rather than the kind of surface play of what's going on the surface. In the final penultimate paragraph, Hegel very famously talks about the gray on gray of philosophy. Yeah. The philosophy's task isn't to engage itself in the brightly covered covering of the world, of what's going on in the world, but to look at the underlying structure. So he so he says the infinitely varied circumstances which take shape within this externality as the essence manifests itself within it, this infinite material and its organization are not the subject matter of philosophy. Yeah, so philosophy has got to do with what we might think of as the basic structure, the basic rational structure of social life, rather than the kind of contingent, what he takes to be the contingent manifestations in the empirical world. So I think one of the big problems with Hegel's philosophy, though, is he doesn't really offer us any principled way of distinguishing between what's at the core and what's merely surface phenomena. Now he gives us some examples. Fichte. Has anyone heard of Fichte? Anyone there still? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Fichte was the sort of generation before Hegel, between Kant and Hegel, and Fichte also was interested in kind of developing the idea of the kind of ideal modern state. And Fichte tries to give a philosophical deduction as for why a modern state is going to need passports. Yeah. And Hegel thought this was ridiculous. So Fichte thought the logic of the modern state involved the idea of the state knowing what everyone was doing at every time. Yeah. So the state for Fichte, the ideal modern state, is a bit of a surveillance state, and the state would have to know where its citizens are, and so the state would require passports that had individuals' pictures on, and the pictures would be painted by a portrait painter. And I think Hegel thought this was absolutely crazy, the idea that a state would require photo IDs of its members. And so he often uses this as an example of a crazy philosopher coming up with a sort of very particular idea of what's needed and what's necessary in the modern state, rather than a surface phenomena. But looking back, we might think, well, maybe Fichte was right. Maybe the passport regulations are part of the core, rather than part of the brightly covered covering. Yeah. So I think one problem with this sort of Hegelian approach is he wants to offer an account of the rational nature of the kind of core of the institutions, and say the task of philosophy should ignore this sort of brightly covered coverings. It should, yep. But he doesn't offer any sort of account of how we distinguish between what's core and what's just part of the contingent coverings. And I think this is one of the kind of big problems in the kind of whole Hegelian type of project, because this is one of the reasons I think the kind of Hegelian project then is quite interesting, because then we can have sort of arguments about what sort of institutions are the sort of necessary basic institutions and what are merely ephemeral, non-essential. Yeah. So, yeah. So Hegel really likes, one of the things about Hegel is he's probably the first German, after Kant, there was this emergence in the German philosophers after Kant became a bit like rappers, and they spent a lot of time dissing each other and seeing who could kind of say the most insulting thing about the other philosopher. So Hegel is full of Hegel, and then with Nietzsche as well, has some of the best sort of insults of other philosophers. My favorite is Schelling. He says, Schelling's philosophy is like the night which all cows are black, which I think is like, your philosophy is like the night in which all cows are black. Yeah. But he thinks that trying to, in your political philosophy, on the one hand, he's against the sort of political philosophy that is into setting up abstract ideals, this sort of Rousseauian idealism. We might think of the ideal philosophy. But he also thinks there's a type of person who calls themselves a political philosopher who gets themselves into all of these minutiae about things like passport regulations and the like. And Hegel thinks that deliberations of this kind, no trace of philosophy remains. Yeah. And so one thing is, it's, you know, it can't be too hot, it can't be too cold, it's got to be just the right temperature. It can't be kind of too abstract ideas, but at the same time, philosophy, the philosophical project, can't really just be about the minutiae of the political society in which you live. Yeah. And then I guess if you start doing this, it seems to me that it seems very difficult to say, is this really looking at the core? How do we know that we're examining the core? Okay, so this is the project. And then he carries on. And once again, I think we've got another formulation of this, but I think it's useful to work through and to hear these different formulations. This treatise, therefore, insofar as it deals with political science, shall be nothing other than an attempt to comprehend and portray the state as an inherently rational entity. And I take it that he's not talking about the state in general, because it's going to turn out that ancient states, we can't do this. Yeah. So when he's talking about comprehending and portraying the state, I think he's talking about the modern state as an inherently rational entity. Yeah. And as a philosophical proposition, it must distance itself as far as possible from the obligation to construct a state as it ought to be. Yeah. Yeah. Such instruction cannot be aimed at instructing the state on how it ought to be, but rather at showing how the state as the ethical universe should be recognized. Yeah. It's going to turn out that he's interested in getting to recognize the rationality of the state, and in so doing, this can lead us to feel at home in the modern world. Yeah. So the task of Hegel's philosophy is to help us feel at home, and help us feel at home within the modern world. And to do that is to take what may at first appear to be something alien and foreign, external rules and normativity, and see this as the expression of our own will. Yeah? If we can see the world in which we find ourselves as a world of our own making, yeah, then this is something that can allow us to feel at home within this world. Now, he's trying as hard as he can here to appear conservative, yeah, for the censors, I take it. But of course, he doesn't. For Hegel, he gives priority to the practical over the theoretical. So the feeling at home in the world, thinking the world, isn't really a matter of abstract contemplation, but it's a matter of acting in the world. Yeah, it's to feel at home in the world is to exist within the world as an agent. Acting within the world as an agent is going to involve changing the world. Yeah, it's going to involve and through our activity, through our rational activity, this is a way of making ourselves feel more at home in the world. Yeah, a home is not something we sort of just find. A home, what makes something a home is that we've sort of made it for ourselves. And so this activity of recognition is not merely this philosophical, taking a theoretical attitude, but recognition has this practical side. And I take it within Hegel, it's predominantly practical. It's to make the world our own. Yeah, and I take it the sort of thought is that the modern world is the sort of world that we can make our own. Now, it may turn out in certain states at certain times we're not able to do that, and that's I think something we have to think ourselves. Yeah. So here is Rhodes. Jump here. Now, I sent you in the handout. He then spent a couple of paragraphs playing with this quotation. And in order to understand the next couple of paragraphs, it's just useful to know the story. So who read the thing on the handout from Aesop's fables? What's Hegel talking about here? Hic Rhodus, hic saltus. Did anyone read the handout? So if people didn't, then I guess. So who wants, if anyone read it, you can tell the story. Otherwise, does someone want to read this? Ejam, do you want to read this? The story of the braggart. This is the story of Aesop. Do people know Aesop? Is he someone who's, his fables, are they well known in Turkey? Aesop's fables?
Yeah, it's Aesop in Turkish, I think. Is that right?
Aesop, yeah. Like he has lots of them. He has the sour grapes. The guy who can't get the grapes and he's like, oh, I didn't want them anyway, they're sour. Yeah. And they're his fables are these short stories that always have a little sort of moral. And yeah, they're quite fun. And this one is the braggart. So who wants to read this? Ejam, are you somewhere quiet, or if you're not, okay. Yeah.
An athlete who had always been criticized by his fellow townsmen for not being much of a man once went away and came back after a rhyme, boasting that besides performing...
After a time.
A time? Okay.
Yeah.
After a time, boasting that besides performing many feats of valor in other cities, at Rhodes,
Rhodes is a city in ancient Greece, but Rhodes also means rose. Yeah, so carry on.
He had made such a jump that none of the Olympic victors could equal it. Moreover, he claimed that he would offer people who were there as witnesses if any of them ever came to town. One of the bystanders spoke up and said to him, well, my friend, if what you say is true, you don't need any witnesses. Here is Rhodes, jump here.
Yeah. So this guy claimed, if I did the biggest jump anyone's ever done, I broke the world record in Rhodes. Yeah. To which someone says, okay, here's Rhodes, jump here. Like, in order, he was claiming, oh, I've got witnesses who can tell you how well I jumped. Yeah. Yeah, so this is the that we should, our great deeds shouldn't be these abstract great deeds that are somewhere else, but our great deeds should be great deeds that are in the here and now. Yeah, that he says, here is Rhodes, jump here. That reason needs to kind of, in some sense, needs to find itself in the present. So he says, and do you want to carry on reading, Ejam? So this is...
Yeah. To comprehend what it is is the task of philosophy, for what is reason. As far as the individual is concerned, each individual is in any case a child of his time. Thus philosophy too is its own time comprehended in thoughts. It is just as foolish to imagine that any philosophy can transcend its contemporary world as that an individual can overlap his own time or leap over roads. Should I continue?
Yeah.
If his theory does indeed transcend his own time, if it builds itself a world as it ought to be, then it certainly has an existence, but only within his opinions. A pliant medium in which the imagination can construct anything it pleases. Okay. With little alteration, the saying just quoted would read, here is the rose, stands here.
Okay, so this is, I mean, here once again, we get an expression of this sort of Hegelian idea. We have this famous saying that each individual is a child of his time. And because each one of us is a child of his time, philosophy too is its own time, comprehended in thought. So what the most we can do in philosophy is to express our own time in thought. And I take it Hegel thought that this is what previous philosophers did. So in the paragraph before, he talks about Plato, or on the page before. And Plato's Republic, a proverbial example of an empty ideal. is essentially the embodiment of nothing other than the nature of Greek ethics. Yeah. And because there was a tension within Greek society, because there was a sort of contradiction within Greek society, as Plato saw it, that this ethical idea could appear immediately only as a yet unsatisfied longing, and hence only as a destructive force. So in some sense, in Plato's time, that because the nature of the society was such that there was this contradiction that hadn't been overcome, that all that the philosophy of that time could appear as was as an unsatisfied longing, as a sort of destructive force. Yeah. And so in an age where where you haven't got actuality, if this age expresses itself politically, it's going to do so in terms of unsatisfied longing. And this unsatisfied longing may present itself as a desire for something that the person takes to be determinate. But this idea, these sort of ideals, are going to be empty. Now, elsewhere, he spends a lot of time talking about the reason for this, about the Greek world. Does anyone know anything about what Hegel has to say about the Greeks? Has anyone got a literature background? So in the phenomenology, he has a very long discussion of the play Antigone. Has anyone read Antigone or know about the story of Antigone? So Antigone, I'll write it down. Yeah, if any of you are interested. It's a tragedy. And Antigone's brother was a rebel, and he lost. There was a civil war, and his side lost. And then the new king basically takes power, Creon, and basically defeats Antigone's brother, the bad guys, and then sets up this new state. And then he orders that the rebels should be treated with sort of they shouldn't be buried. And then Antigone is sort of torn between her sort of loyalty to the state. It's about the tension between loyalty to the state and then loyalty to private morality. Yeah, you've got the external law, which says don't bury your brother, and then you've got this inner duty to your brother. You've got a conflict between two duties, the sort of political duty and the private duties. And Hegel thinks that within the ancient world, this tension wasn't overcome. Yeah, there was no. Whereas he thinks one of the things about modernity is that it's incorporated these sort of private duties to your family and friends into the political realm. And this is his account of ethical life that we'll talk about later. Yeah. So he thinks that the philosophy, all it can really do, or at least political philosophy, is to express the kind of values, the norms of its own time in thought. And insofar as there's a kind of tension in norms, that all philosophy can do is to express this. And in such case, it's going to be a sort of blind longing. Yeah, a blind longing for some sort of unity without really being able to see. The way we discover how to overcome these tensions is through action, not through abstract philosophy. Yeah, the task of philosophy is to change the world. Yeah, I think this is a sort of Hegelian idea. So he introduces this idea of here's roads, jump here. But roads in Latin means rose. So this could also, and saltus can mean jump, but it can also mean dance or party. Yeah. So he says, here is the road, jump here. And he makes this point about do it here and now. His way of saying this is here is the rose, dance here. And this image of the sort of rose in the cross he then appeals to. But and so the rose in the cross is the idea of beauty and joy within suffering. Yeah, that it's the idea of the divine within the temporal. Yeah, so he's got this, once again, there's a sort of Christian, a bit of Christian iconography here. Yeah, so he says, what lies between reason as self-conscious spirit and reason as present actuality? What separates the former, so reason as sort of subjective reason, and reason as objective reason? So you've got reason as self-conscious spirit, the sort of reason of the individual subject, and then reason as present actuality, yeah, between, you know, reason as subjective Geist and reason as objective Geist. What separates the former from the latter and prevents it finding satisfaction in it? What stops the conscious subject from being satisfied with the present is the fetter of some abstraction or other. Yeah. So very often we're not able to enjoy the present. We're not able to affirm the present. We're not able to affirm our lives. It's because of the chains. The fetter is like something that you chain up an animal with. Yeah. So the fetter of some abstraction or other, some ideal, some abstract ideal, which has not been liberated into the form of the concept. Yeah. So to recognize reason as the rose in the cross of the present. So the cross is kind of site of suffering. The rose in the cross is the divine, the beautiful, the sublime, however you want to think of it, within the temporal, and thereby to delight in the present. Yeah, this rational insight is the reconciliation with actuality, which philosophy grants to those who have received the inner call to comprehend. So the kind of goal of his philosophy is to allow us to delight in the present, yeah, to allow us to be happy, to help us be happy with our lives as they are in the world. And the way we do that is to see the rationality of our lives. Yeah. So we can think of this from the theoretical perspective aspect, that in terms of a type of comprehension. But we can also think of this in terms of preserving their subjective freedom in the realm of the substantial. Yeah, and at the same time to stand with their subjective freedom, not in a particular and contingent situation, but in what has being in and for itself. Now, this is a weird Hegelian clause. So to stand with our subjective freedom, so we find ourselves in these situations, and we may take the sort of situations we find ourselves in as sort of limits on our freedom, as sort of contingent. We may find ourselves in the world and see the kind of aspects of the substantial world around us as sort of limiting our subjective freedom. What he wants is that we want to see the situation, okay, the realm of the substantial is in the kind of, you know, in the objective social world. So how can we preserve our subjective freedom in the objective social world in which we're born into? Yeah. Well, in some sense, we've got to regard the aspects of the world not as particular and contingent, but as having being in and for itself. Now, this idea of being in and for itself is a Hegelian idea that we're going to come across a lot. That one way of thinking about this is that if something has being in and for itself, it has a certain type of necessity. Yeah, that something has being in itself. So something can be free in itself, but not for itself. Yeah, so being in itself, we may think of as something like potentiality. Yeah, that if something has being in and for itself, it has actuality. Its potentiality has been actualized. So we're going to come across a bunch of times when Hegel talks about being in and for itself. And as we look at these different usages, hopefully you'll start to get a grasp of how Hegel uses this terminology. One thing about Hegel's, yeah, I should take a break. Sorry, I got carried away by Hegel. The eternal basically took over, and the temporal, yeah, do tell me when I should have a break. Okay, so, okay. So let's have a 10-minute break. Let's start at kind of 1/4 past. Does that sound cool? And I will. Okay. I'm back. Can people see me? Yeah, so we've got this idea of the goal of philosophy is reconciliation with the present, this overcoming of alienation. And the book as a whole sort of works like this, that when I think about what I am, there's different ways I can think of myself, yeah? But I can think of myself as, there's two ways of thinking of myself that we're going to look at tomorrow or next week that he takes to be inadequate. So one way of looking at ourselves, so one of the things about ourselves is that we're reflexive individuals. We're, Charles Taylor has said, what's central to Hegel is the idea that we're self-interpreting animals. We're animals that don't just live and act in the world, but are able to reflect and interpret our activity, to evaluate our drives and desires. So we're creatures that are capable of reflecting on and evaluating what we do. Now, when I think about what I am, there's one way of thinking of myself that is purely abstract. I can think of myself as, in some sense, a being that's capable of standing back from contingency and making a judgment about it. Yep, I have the capacity for whatever I desire, whatever drives me, to ask myself, is this what I really want? Yep, so I've got this capacity to stand back from myself. And this is sort of central to what differentiates us from animals, Hegel thinks. This capacity to evaluate our drives and desires. But if we identify with this fully, this sort of I, as the evaluative I, is just pure potentiality. It can stand against anything. Yep, it's a sort of empty, formal notion of the self. Yep, so this is sort of inadequate. I can also think of myself in terms of what I've done. Yeah, of all the choices that I've made. I can think of myself as a series of individual particular choices. I can think of this sort of autobiographical self, yeah, but just understood as a series of choices. Now, identifying myself with what I am, I want to say concretely, but Hegel thinks concrete is good because it combines the two. Yep. But thinking of myself in this way, in some sense, I just see myself as something that's sort of thrown about by the wind with no real unifying force. Now, Hegel thinks that in the modern world, I live in this world, and he thinks that when he's talking about modernity, he thinks there are three things that are three aspects of modernity that constitute the sort of rational core of it. That we have the sort of modern family life. We have modern civil society, and we have the modern state. Yeah. So in the modern world, that when I think about what I am, we think about ourselves in terms of the family, civil society, and the state. Yeah. And in some sense, it's this I that, and so I think of myself as a son, as a father, as a husband. And being a son, father, and a husband, I have particular duties and obligations and things I should do that are constitutive of what it is to be a father and a husband. And then I'm also a teacher. Yeah, I'm also, this is part of what I am in my civil society. You might think of there are certain norms that govern your behavior in terms of things like professional ethics, in terms of the position you hold in society. Yeah, there are certain norms that govern you guys as students. Yeah, there are things you should do as students. And then, of course, at least you guys are sort of citizens, yeah, in a vaguely rational state. Yeah, we may think of, now, what about me as a sort of rootless cosmopolitan? Yeah, kind of living as a as a foreigner without rights, without representation. I think that in some sense, Hegel is going to say that we face problems, refugees. So I think there's going to be sort of problems. But Hegel thinks that in the modern world, that if we look in the final section, the final third of the book is about what he calls ethical life. And the realm of ethical life, he explains, involves the family, civil society, and the state. And I take it what's central here is that as a kind of someone who lives in the modern world, that my identity is sort of constituted by the fact that I'm a father, I'm a teacher, I may be a citizen. Yep. And insofar as we can understand these sort of roles, so these roles are first of all constitutive of who I am. Yep. And secondly, that Hegel thinks that when we think through this, we can understand and see the rationality in these institutions. We can understand and see the rationality in the institutions of the family, civil society, and the state. Yeah. And insofar as we can come to see the rationality within these institutions, we can then, in some sense, come to identify with ourselves in a concrete sense. What I am is a father and a teacher, and as a father and a teacher, I find myself in a normative environment. There are things I should do as a teacher and as a father and as a husband. But these, insofar as I can understand the necessity of these institutions, the reason behind these institutions, the way in which these institutions are in some sense an expression of my freedom, I'm kind of putting quotation marks all around this, then I can be kind of reconciled. Then they don't appear to me as alien. Yeah, that when I look after Alijan, okay, I've got to go, I need to look after Alijan. And I'm driven by a sort of ought, but this ought is not alien from me. Yeah, this is something I do willingly, and I preserve my subjective freedom in the realm of the substantial. The fact that I have to go up and look after Alijan isn't loss of freedom, yeah, but it's a preservation of freedom. Now, well, once again, I think the kind of story here is quite interesting. And then I think, of course, when we start looking at the details, we can look at what Hegel says about the family and civil society. You know, he's like, oh, you have this family, and then in the family you have the head of the household, and then the head of the household can go out and have a job and kind of interact in civil society. And you might be, hold on a minute, yeah. You may think that there are certain limitations here and contradictions here, just as slavery, there is contradictions within slave societies that members of the societies may not have seen. The sort of the sexism of 18th century Germany, if we can look at it from our perspective and see that the sort of 18th century family that Hegel's talking about is a family that in some sense doesn't express freedom. Yeah, but I take it the sort of the way to be reconciled to actuality is going to involve seeing the institutions within which, well, the institutions within which we find ourselves as expressions of freedom, whatever that means. Yeah, they're somehow these institutions are expression of the drive towards freedom. Yeah. And then I think that once you've seen the basic idea, then Hegel kind of looks at his institutions, and then looking back at what Hegel says, we can see the kind of way in which his philosophy is an expression of his own time. And maybe we come beyond that. Yep. So Hegel definitely has a sort of progressive view of history. Yeah, he's not a postmodernist. He thinks that there is some, insofar as we are reconciled to the present, we have to take a progressive view of history, because we have to see the emergence of the institutions within our own society as rational. Yeah, so there's a sort of existentialist reading of Hegel where this is a choice, where we can either rebel or we can choose to be reconciled. But part of the choice to be reconciled involves telling a progressive historical story, because understanding the rationality of the institutions we live in, part of that is going to be to understand the emergence of the institutions. Yeah, so this is the story. What has being in and for itself is something that has actuality, has rationality. It's not merely potentially rational, but actually rational. This is the idea. Now, there's a little thing about Luther. Now, he's not arguing that we should live at peace with actuality. We should just settle on it. Yeah, there's a sort of one way of living at peace with the world is just to give up hope. Yeah. So, and you might think there's certain aspects of this within Protestantism, where the world is so broken that we should just live at peace with the world, with the hope for sort of salvation in a later world. And so we should live at peace with actuality out of a sort of indifference, out of giving up hope. But he wants to say, no, the peace which cognition establishes with the actual world has more warmth than this. Yeah, and then this is another very famous passage. So does someone want to read this? Because this is a big one. This is one of, on the greatest hits of Hegel album. This is one of the tunes that's played a lot. So Zeynep, do you want to read this? Or you? Someone?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Okay.
Further word on the subject of issuing instructions on how the world ought to be, philosophy at any rate always comes too late to perform this function. As the thought of the world, it appears only at a time when actuality has gone through its formative process and attained its completed state. This lesson of concept is necessarily also apparent from history, namely, that is only when actuality has reached maturity that the ideal appears opposite the real and reconstructs this real world, which it has grasped in its substance in the shape of an intellectual realm. When philosophy paints its gray in gray, a shape of life has grown old and it cannot be rejuvenated but only recognized by the gray in gray of philosophy. The owl of Minerva begins its flight only with the onset of dusk. Yeah,
so, philosophy is a self-reflexive activity, so it's sort of reflexive. And then in order for philosophy to kind of actually have any content, there needs to be something it reflects on. It's the sort of slightly empiricist side of Hegel. Yeah, there needs to be some content upon which thought reflects. And so philosophy is the thought of the world. Yep, and it appears only at a time when actuality has gone through its formative process. Now, it sounds like there's no task of philosophy here, but I mean, he says the lesson of the concept is necessarily also apparent from history, namely that it's only when actuality has reached maturity that the ideal appears opposite the real and reconstructs this real world. So I take it though that you have a sort of an ideal that has the concept that has emerged in reality, yeah, and we can only and only when actuality has reached maturity that then this ideal can appeal as opposite of the real. So there's certain ideas that are implicit in the sort of structure, in certain sort of structures. And when a sort of certain type of social structure has reached its sort of maturity, then we get this bifurcation between the ideal and the real. And it's this bifurcation between the ideal and the real that then leads to further development, further change, further evolution. Yeah, so it's only when actuality has reached its maturity that the ideal appears opposite the real and reconstructs this real world. So actually, there is a sort of, it looks like there isn't really a task for philosophy, but, and this, you know, it looks like he's a bit of a quietist, you might think, and this is how he presents himself to the senses. But I take it that when the ideal appears opposite the real, yeah, that in some sense, this bifurcation leads to a sort of reconstruction of the real. It leads to further progress and further forms emerging. Then once these forms have emerged, then we can kind of come to understand the ideals implicit within the institutions. I take it like we have these embodied ideals that emerge through history, that in some sense, we can only really think of them once they've emerged. This is the sort of empiricist idea. But once they've emerged, then you get a tension between the ideal and the real, which can then lead to further change, yeah, and the emergence of new institutions, new structures. So you might think since the time of Hegel, this sort of position in women in society, we've got the emergence of new family structures because of the tensions within the sort of 18th century patriarchal family. And then the appearance of this ideal, yeah, is something within the society. Okay, so that's the preface. Let's jump to the introduction. Any thoughts about the preface, or shall we? Oh, hold on. What just happened? Okay, so let's jump to the introduction. So the subject matter of the philosophy of right, yeah, is the idea of right. And right, I mean, it's a very broad concept in German. We can think of this as justice, we can think of this as law, we can think of this as, I take it that within his system, he's thinking of this as objective Geist. So I take the realm of right as basically the sort of the realm of social normativity. Yeah, this is going to involve law, what we might think of as positive law. It's going to involve morality and ideas of the good. Yeah, and it's going to involve the sort of norms embodied in institutions. It's going to involve professional ethics, the norms that govern our sort of what Hegel talks of as civil society, yeah, and it's going to involve the sort of the laws of the state and our role as citizens. So the notion of right is broadly understood as I think it's the idea of social norms and social normativity. We might think it's the notion of society, because I think for Hegel, society's social interaction is essentially is essentially normative. It's got to do with the sort of norms that govern social interaction. Now, and the idea is a technical term in Hegel. So an idea is not something abstract. An idea is something concrete. An idea is a kind of concrete concept. It involves both something concrete that manifests the idea. It's embodied thought. It's embodied reason. It's embodied concept. So he says philosophy has to do with ideas, and therefore not with what are commonly described as mere concepts. So I think often in philosophy we have the idea of mere concepts. Sorry. And these are sort of abstractions. Often when we think of concepts, we think of concepts as sort of abstractions from reality. So you've got reality, which is out there, and then you've got our thought about reality, which is an abstract representation of what's real that exists only in our minds. That's not how Hegel understands concepts. Yeah, it's not how Hegel understands thought. That there is this use of concepts as sort of subjective representations. And this is a very one-sided, this is the realm of abstraction. He's interested in the idea of Rye. What he's interested is what we might think of as embodied normativity. And ultimately, all normativity is embodied. Yeah, it's the individual normativity, we're animals with bodies, but normative structures are embodied in social institutions, in roles, and the like. Yeah, so on the contrary, the idea, shows the latter, the kind of mere concepts, are one-sided and lacking in truth. The abstraction is always one-sided for Hegel, and truth involves the idea. So whenever you've got an abstraction, whenever you've got abstract thought, it's always going to be one-sided. It's not that he's against abstract thought, but he's against forgetting that abstract thought is an abstraction and mistaking the abstract for the real. Yep. And it's the concept alone, yeah, the concept understood as the kind of rational side of the concrete, not what is so often called by that name, but which is merely an abstract determination of the understanding. So often people, when they talk about concepts, what they mean are these abstractions. For him, concepts are embodied, and the idea involves both the concept and its actualization. And that is the concept alone which has actuality. Yeah. Everything other than this actuality, which is posited by the concept itself, is transitory existence, external contingency, opinion, appearance without essence, untruth, and deception. So this other stuff, yeah, this transitory existence, remember we made a distinction between the sort of base and the superstructure. The base that's written in gray of philosophy, and the colorful surface play. So this sort of surface play, yeah, is transitory existence, external contingency, opinion, appearance without essence, etc. Yeah, the concept, the idea underlying is the sort of basic structure of the society, the underlying rational structure of the institutions, not their surface form. Yeah, so we get Hegel's explanation, then we get his explanation, and then we get his lecture notes. And his lecture notes here are I think useful. So is there someone who hasn't read anything who wants to read this edition? Any volunteers? Otherwise, I'll have to ask Ecem again. Do you want to read this? So this is, yeah, so do you want to read this?
Yeah, the concept and its existence are two aspects of the same thing, separate and united, like soul and body. The body is the same life as the soul, and yet the two can be said to lie outside one another. A soul without a body would not be a living thing, and vice versa. Thus, the existence of the concept is its body, just as leather obeys the soul which produced it. The buds have the tree within them and contain its entire strength, although they are not yet the tree itself. The tree corresponds entirely to the simple image of the bud. If the body does not correspond to the soul, it's a wretched thing indeed. The unity of existence and the concept of body and soul is the idea. It is not just a harmony, but a complete interpenetration. Nothing lives which is not in some way idea. The idea of right is freedom, and in order to be truly apprehended, it must be recognizable in its concept and in the concept's existence.
Okay, so that's really crazy, all this stuff, yeah? We've got the concept in its existence. I take it, he says, well, one way of thinking about this is the relationship between body and soul, not in a Cartesian sense of a dualist understanding of body and soul. But I take it, we might think of I think probably the biggest influence on Hegel is Aristotle. Yeah, so I mean, if you're ever struggling to understand Hegel, often the kind of first thing to do is to think, what might Aristotle say about this? Yeah, and so one way of thinking about the relationship between the concept and existence is in terms of the relationship between body and soul, understood in Aristotelian terms, in terms of something like form and matter. Yeah, so the soul is the form of the body. That this is going to be the principle of life. So everything living has a sort of jan, you might think, in Aristotle's terminology, that everything that living is an alijan. No, has some. That's one reason I like jan. So alijan, yeah. The first thing I learned in Turkish, jam jana değil jan jana. Yeah, but also I like jan. Yeah, because it's a sort of Aristotelian, like suke. Yeah, but nothing lives which is not in some way idea. Nothing lives that doesn't have some sort of form. So we've got this distinction between form and matter. We might think one way of thinking about this, but we've also got this distinction between potential and actual. So another image he's using is the bud and the tree, yeah, or the seed and the tree. Yeah, so the buds have the tree within them and contain its entire strength, although they are not yet the tree itself. Yeah, so one way of thinking about the relationship between the concept and the existence and the actuality is in terms of the relationship between potential and actuality. Yeah, and I think when we think of that man is a rational animal, yeah, that the form of the human soul is rationality. Yeah, a human being is actually rational. This is a kind of, you might think this is an Aristotelian idea, but what that means is that we have the potential. Yeah, a baby, a sort of infant, is a human being. Yeah, but they haven't realized their rationality. Yeah, to realize our rationality is to go through a process of education, Bildung in German. Yeah, that you might think that our being as a sort of rational being is, we've got our nature, then we've got this second nature that is our potential becoming actualized through Bildung, through education. Yeah, so but I mean, in some sense, one of the things about Hegel is he's into this sort of embodied cognition. Yeah, he thinks that agency is something that we're essentially embodied creatures, and the human body can't really exist without the mind, because otherwise it wouldn't be a body. It wouldn't be a human body. Like, you get rid of the form and you don't have a human body anymore. You have an ex-body. And that the mind, the agency, can't exist without the body, because the agency is a sort of is the structure, the form of the body. Now, yeah, so the unity of existence and the concept, so, is the idea. It's the unity of form and matter, of body and soul. Yeah, that it's the idea is the realization of potential, the actualization of what's potential. Yeah. And yeah. And it's not just a harmony, so it's not Cartesian. Well, Descartes himself actually, it's not this parody of Descartes, but the mind and body are interpenetrate. Yeah, remember Descartes, I think Descartes himself sort of said this. So Descartes says, you know, the relationship between the mind and body is not like the relationship between a pilot and the ship, but you have this sort of union. And nothing lives which is in not some way idea. So at least when we're looking at living nature, everything in the living world has to be understood in terms of, you know, potentiality and actuality. I take it he thinks that we have these emergent processes of striving. So he says all of this stuff. You say, okay, I make sense of this. And then he says, oh, and by the way, the idea of right is freedom. Now this is like in the addition, we've got the kind of, this is what he tells us, we get the kind of the development of his view. And then in the kind of final little footnote, we have, oh, by the way, the idea of right is freedom. Yeah. And this is going to be, the idea of freedom is going to be central to his whole project. So let's have a look at what he has to say about freedom. So I'm going to jump now to 27, because, yeah, now he says, so we have these, it's going to turn out we have these two inadequate ways of thinking about the age of agency. One of them is in terms of universality, one of them is in terms of particularity. And then we have this, the absolute is the proper way of doing things. So whenever you're talking about the absolute, this is kind of Hegel's, this is good. Yeah, this is, yeah. And the absolute in Hegel, in some sense, involves these two opposites. Yeah, it involves these two things that one might think of as diametrically opposed to each other. We have these two limited, one-sided ways of thinking about ourselves. And then we have this absolute conception of ourselves, which allows us to overcome this duality in some way. Yeah, the Marxists sometimes talk about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That doesn't work for Hegel, but this is what they're talking about. The absolute is like the synthesis in that way. I know some of our students have read Marx, yeah, maybe looking at Hegel through Marx, but the absolute determination. So this is freedom properly understood, properly comprehended, or if one prefers, the absolute drive of the free spirit is to make freedom into its object, to make it objective, both in the sense that it becomes the rational system of the spirit itself, and in the sense that this system becomes immediate actuality. This enables the spirit to be for itself as idea what the will is in itself. I take it that moving from being what it is in itself to being in and for itself involves the kind of realization of the potentiality. Yeah. So we are free in ourselves, but so is the child. The child is rational in itself, but its rationality hasn't developed. So it's not rational for us or for itself. Yeah. Thus, the abstract concept of the idea of the will is in general the free will that wills the free will. Yeah. So the idea of freedom is going to be the idea of the will that wills itself. We've got this idea of freedom of self-determination. And then the idea is that the institutions in our society, insofar as we can see them as the expression of freedom, then we can be sort of reconciled to these institutions. Okay, Hegel's just yeah, the thing with Hegel is that you read Hegel and you think you understand for a bit, and then it's just like there's just more kind of crazy stuff. Yeah. So Hegel, I said I'm giving you a bit of meze. I'm giving you a taster of Hegel. But yeah, this is the introduction. Next class, probably I'll just have a chance to look at numbers 2 and 3. And numbers 2 and 3 in the introduction are sort of digressions, but they're interesting digressions. Number 2 is about the idea of philosophy is circular. I'll just mention something about this. But number 3 has got to do with his understanding of history and historical justification. And in some sense, we get a sort of rejection of historicism. Yeah, because something can be justified historically, but can be wrong in itself. Yeah, so we might think of slavery as this is an example that Hegel gives. So number 3, he looks at the limits of historical justification, which I think, if you think about this, this also pushes against a kind of very conservative reading of Hegel. So there's a kind of form of pure historicism that he's rejecting, which is a very conservative position. And the sort of example of this is Savigny. He was a kind of conservative Prussian jurist who he's sort of disagreeing with. So next class, I'll look at 2 and 3. And then next week, maybe starting next class, I want to look at numbers 4, 5, 6, and 7. And it may be that's all we look at, and then we finish Hegel. I don't know. But I want to work through 4, 5, 6, and 7, kind of really paragraph by paragraph. Maybe I'll skip a few, but I want you to read, at least over the weekend, read 4, 5, 6, and 7 really carefully and see if it makes any sense to you. And it's not very much reading, but it's really quite dense. It's like 4 or 5 pages. And let's try and work through it and, yeah, see what's going on there. And it gives you, I think, the whole of the Hegelian system in microcosm. So I think one thing about Hegel, you get this kind of Hegelian 3-step. And this is an example of the kind of Hegelian 3-step, where we get these 2 one-sided ways of thinking about things, and then we get the sort of the will is the unity of these 2 moments, of the universal and the particular. And I think if you get this, then he just does this over and over again in lots of different contexts, where we look at these 2 things that are both contain some truth, but they're both abstract in some way. And we've got to overcome them to arrive at a kind of picture that kind of, in some sense, combines both of them. And this combination can't be understood. It's sort of incomprehensible in some sense. It involves reason and thinking rather than just the understanding. Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow face to face, and have fun. Happy International Women's Day. If anyone's allowed to celebrate, I don't know. Are we allowed to say that anymore? Yeah. Okay, ciao.